Love and Daniel Shepard, my fellow maintainers. You guys want to say hi?
How's it going?
Hey, how's it going?
This is our second community call. This is a series of calls that we're going to be doing throughout this year and hopefully well into the future, where we talk, we spend about half an hour or so going through just kind of what's going on in the world of NetBox, current initiatives, anything that's interesting that we see going on in the community, partner projects, things like that. The intended audience here is really for anyone who currently uses NetBox or is thinking about using NetBox. And our goal really is just to keep the community engaged and informed throughout, as we progress with with NetBox itself. In this call today, we're going to be covering some of the features that are coming up in NetBox version 3.2, including the newly enhanced and extended plugins framework. We'll talk about some ways you can get involved if you're interested in contributing to the project or one of its ancillary projects such as plugins. And finally, we'll wrap up with some Q&A from the community. So first and foremost, NetBox version 3.2. This was actually released on Tuesday, February 15th. So it's been out for about a week now, and we've had a great response so far. The final release is planned for April 4th. So we did this one a little bit early. We got about 6 or 7 weeks ahead of that. And the reason being the new plugins framework that we've extended. We want to give plugin authors and contributors plenty of time to experiment with it, adapt their plugins, provide feedback, so that we hit 3.2.0 with a very, very mature and robust implementation of the framework and don't have to play catch up with any bugs that are reported after the fact. If you'd like to experiment with it, the release is available on GitHub, and we also have the public demo running at beta-demo.netbox.dev. Credentials are just admin if you want to log into that, play around with it. You won't be able to experiment with all of the new features because some of them are static configuration settings, and obviously not the plugins framework. But all the most of the stuff that we'll talk about here today, you can test out right now using that demo. So first up for the feature list in 3.2, a new addition that I'm very excited about. I know it'll probably come as a relief to a lot of people, especially those with chassis-based switches, is the ability to model properly, finally, field replaceable modules within devices like chassis-based switches, like you see there, the Juniper EX9208. You look at a device like that, and it is one switch, but it has field replaceable modules or line cards, if you will, each of which has its own set of components. So interfaces typically that can be swapped out. In the past, people have tried modeling things like this as with child devices. That doesn't really work out. We discourage people from doing that. But finally, here we have the ability to do that. Prior to NetBox 3.2, the proper way, quote unquote, to model this would just be to have inventory items represent the modules, and then just add the interface and so forth directly to the device. We don't have to do that anymore. We actually have the ability now in NetBox 3.2 to define a module type, which looks a lot like a device type, as a sort of a template for that piece of hardware with its own components, typically interfaces that are associated with it, and then install that into module bays that are created within the device. And you can see that in the demo right now that we just mentioned, if you want to play around with that. We've also already opened up the device type library to support module types as well now. So if you go to the device type library on GitHub, I'll drop some links in the comments on this video once we're done recording. But you'll see two folders basically in the root now. We have device types and we have module types. So the workflow is essentially that you add a device bay, or multiple device bays to a device type, instantiate the device types. Now you have an EX9208 with, for example, 6 module bays in it. And then once you have that device created, you then take module types and just install them into the module bays, and all of your interfaces or other components get automatically populated on the device. And what's really neat about that is we have the ability to dynamically rename them based on the module position. So for example, if you are in Bay 4 and your module type defines interfaces as xe-module and braces /0/1 through 48, x/0/1 becomes 4/0/1 because it's in position 4. So very convenient. Hopefully it'll be alleviate a lot of the pain in modeling these chassis-based devices. Second up, we have object-based custom fields. This has been something people have asked for some time now. The idea is that we're extending the existing custom fields functionality to allow administrators to define custom fields that can reference either one or multiple other objects in NetBox of arbitrary types. So in this example, we see that we've defined a custom field that references a site. And here's what that looks like. When you go to create the custom field, you'll notice that this is an example where we've created a custom field for the tenant model named primary site. It is of type object, so the two new types are object or multi-object. And the object type to which this is referring is a site. So that gives us this output here. When we're looking at a tenant, it has the customer ID is another, just a text custom field, and then the primary site here is an actual link to the related object. And that pops up on the REST API just as you'd expect. It looks exactly like any other generic foreign key relationship, so it should be pretty easy to adapt any integrations you have for that. Next feature coming up, and again, Matt or Dan, feel free to jump in, but if you have anything to share as well. I don't want to just to be the Jeremy show, but we'll keep going through these features. The next one we have coming up is status choices. So this is the ability for a NetBox administrator to either override or append the default status choices for various fields in NetBox. So for example, if you go to create a site, out of the box, NetBox will have status values or choices of what is it, like active, planned, staged, deprecated, or retired, or something like that. If you want to add additional values or choices to that for that field, now you can do so by declaring the field choices configuration parameter, specifying the field name there, and then just providing a list of tuples that provide at minimum a value and a human-friendly label, and optionally a color as well. And it's in the documentation as far as what's the formats that are supported and the fields that are supported, as well as the different color choices. The color is optional. If you don't define one, it just comes out as gray. Most people will want to put a color in there. You'll notice that there's a plus sign after the .status in that string there. That's telling NetBox to append those values to what's built in. If we omit the plus sign, the values that we provide in the configuration will override what's built into NetBox. So that's in the case if you want to remove some of the existing choices. Another major feature in 3.2 is user preferences, or improved user preferences, I should say. So for one, we've enhanced the form that exists in the UI to make it a little bit easier for people to toggle their preferences. So that's things like the default pagination size, the placement of the pagination controls, things like that. But admins can also define a default, and we've had this come up in a conversation a few times where people have asked, "Hey, can I pick like what the site list looks like by default for users? Like, can I pick the default columns and such?" So now you're able to do that by defining default user preferences as a config parameter, and then within each table, you can specify both the default columns and the ordering that is in use as well. So that's, for example, if you want to have only show like the name and status columns for a site by default, you can do that. Users are still free to configure their own preferences. So if they decide they want to see different columns, they can do that, and it'll still retain a user-specific definition for that preference. If they go to reset that, then it will fall back to whatever the administrator has defined. And if there is no admin defined preference for a specific table, it will of course just fall back to the default. So that's another degree of flexibility and customization that'll show up in 3.2. Some other ones we can hit on real quick. Inventory items, templates and roles. So now inventory items can be templatized on device types, just like many other components. There are some historic reasons why we didn't do that initially, but now it's possible. So you can templatize things like, NIC cards or other components that might exist that aren't really components in themselves. Those can be added to device types, and they'll get instantiated just like console ports or interfaces or any other components. You can also assign a role now to inventory items. Service templates are another one that's actually one of our older feature requests we finally got around to, is the ability to define templates for services. So instead of going through and manually defining the protocol and port number for service every time, we have templates. You can define either individual services or sets of services to make it a lot easier just to apply those to devices or virtual machines. So just another convenience factor. And the last major feature that we'll touch on, there's a lot more in the release notes, but the last one we'll touch on for this call is automatically provisioning VLAN, available VLAN IDs from a VLAN group. So this is very similar to the next available functionality that we see for prefixes or IP addresses. Like when you go to a prefix and you go to available IPs or available prefixes on the REST API endpoint, same thing exists now for VLANs, but instead of addresses, we're looking at VLAN IDs. You can also, within a VLAN group, you can now define a minimum and maximum valid VLAN ID. So let's say you have a VLAN group called, I don't know, data VLANs, and you start at VLAN ID 100 and goes up to 199. If VLANs 100 through 110 are already created and you request the next available, it will give you VLAN ID 111. And again, that's something you can play with very easily using the demo instance, which again is at beta-demo.netbox.dev. You guys have anything of note before we move on to the plugins? I'll try to keep it moving. I know we're kind of pressed for time. We got a lot to cover today.
Yeah, nothing for me. Doing a good job.
Thanks.
Keep up the good work.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the major improvements in 3.2 is the greatly extended plugins framework. So this is being guided by Working Group 8333. We've had a number of people from the community reach out and volunteer to participate in the communication in the discussion there, where it's basically we're getting feedback from a bunch of folks who have worked with plugins, developed or even released as open source NetBox plugins in the past, trying to harness or I guess document and address the pain points and opportunities for expansion there. And we've made quite a good deal of progress. I'm pretty happy with what we've done. So we've taken things like the generic views that NetBox uses internally. We've refactored a bunch of those, made them actually suitable for use outside of NetBox itself. So now you have things like the basic CRUD operations. So view, add, edit, delete, and some of the bulk like import and export views. Those are available for plugins, for use by plugins. We have a base model class now that is used for available for plugins to enable features like custom fields, webhooks, journaling, tags, all the stuff you find on a typical NetBox model now that can be easily leveraged by a plugin. That can be done either, you can basically subclass the NetBox model Python class to get all the features, or you can implement them piecemeal by subclassing specific mixing classes that we provide. We've also got base classes for forms, filter sets, tables, all kind of like the normal core components of NetBox. So those become available for plugins, and in most cases, I think all cases actually, those are being used internally. So we are, I guess, what we call dog fooding, where if you're inheriting NetBox model, for example, well, that's the same thing that like the site model is using internally to NetBox. So you are using the same exact thing. It's not a separate class of or suite of classes for plugins specifically. Following the generic views, we've got some function-specific templates as well. We've updated and expanded those so that they are more easily extended or overridden by using template blocks, like content blocks within the Django templating language. So those are available, as well as custom tags and filters. We've started making some of those available. Not just everything yet. Some of them still need to be kind of improved or made more robust so that they become suitable for use externally. But that's kind of a work in progress, and I think we've got a number of them available already. The GraphQL API can also be extended by plugins now, just as the REST API has is already supported through its own plugin can provide its own URLs and views for REST API. Now it can hook into the GraphQL API to extend that as well. And a bit of additional good news is through all of this, we've managed not to break any of the existing plugins framework. the important caveat to recognize there is that, again, I'm talking about the supported plugins framework in NetBox 3.1 and earlier. If you've taken the liberty of pulling out components that are not documented or supported, there's a good chance those have broken because a lot of the internal components have been refactored. But it is, I can say from experience of having worked on a couple plugins now, that it's actually pretty easy to refactor into the new 3.2 framework. So that's a boon for sure. Here's a real quick example of just showing how you can subclass NetBox model for a plugin provided model very simply. So just by subclassing NetBox model, that automatically enables custom fields, custom links, webhooks, tags, journaling, everything that you'd see in NetBox core models, basically. And then here's an example of a view by leveraging the object list generic view from NetBox and just defining basically a query set, a filter set, and form, and a table. That's all you need really to replicate a view that you see in NetBox. And again, all of these are supported. So the filter set is provided by NetBox, or you can use Django filter set. The Django filters package filter set class. You could use that directly if you wanted to, but the one that NetBox provides includes things like the dynamic lookup generation. So you can do the dunders to specify like greater than, less than on integer filters and that sort of thing. And then the table is, there's a base table class as well. So I think, checked off all the boxes that you need to basically replicate any of the core functionality that you see in NetBox today. That said, we're still actively soliciting feedback from people who have developed plugins or have worked on plugins in the past. Our intent here over the next month or so is to, again, I think I said that we're releasing or planning to release 3.2.0 final on the week of April 4th or just early April. We are intending to leverage the entire month of March basically to solicit feedback and actively engage with developers around the plugins framework specifically. What else do you want to see? We can't extend the scope too much because there's already a lot going on with it. But as far as what's within scope now, how can we make it better? Are there bugs? Can we, is there friction that we can reduce? Things like that. So now is definitely the time to get that feedback out to us because we have basically free reign during the beta period. Once 3.2.0 final is out, everything's locked down. We can fix bugs, but we can't add anything until 3.3. So by all means, play around with it. Let us know what you think. If you're interested in joining the working group, that's available. That's still open for folks. We are restricting it to people who have some experience with plugins, primarily because we want to focus on feedback from real-world implementations and development rather than having it become kind of like a training ground. That will happen. Probably we'll provide some more training material as we approach 3.2.0 and immediately following that final release. I can say from experience, I've gone through, I volunteered to take the NetBox DNS plugin. I did some work on that to bring it up to speed for 3.2. Pretty straightforward. I did find some, took some lessons learned there to adapt the plugins framework in NetBox to make things a little bit smoother, a little bit easier. But for the most part, it was a couple hours of work. I'm going through that now with the NetBox BGP plugin as well. Just going through, taking, what exists in there now, kind of refactoring it to leverage what's being provided in the new framework, and it's going very well. So I'm very, very encouraged by that. Next slide we have here was just, sorry, Dan, did you have something?
As I say, just if people are interested, they can actually look at the documentation for the plugin framework by just looking at the feature branch of read the docs, right?
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. I forgot to mention that. So if you go to read the docs, where the NetBox documentation is hosted, you'll notice that the URL ends in /stable. If you replace that with /feature, then that will actually link you to the current 3.2 feature beta documentation, and I'll drop a link to that in the comments as well. Thanks for pointing that out. Finally, this is a repeat of the earlier or last month's community call, so I'm going to just cover this real quick. But if you are interested in getting involved with contributing to NetBox, there's two paths. We have code contributions and non-code contributions. For the former, there's lots of issues out there waiting for volunteers. Just open GitHub issues and search by the needs owner tag. You'll probably find 30 or 40 issues on any given day that are just everyone's agreed that yes, this work should be done, and we're just waiting for someone to own it. It's pretty easy to get started. Just pick something that looks interesting, go through the contributing policy and the getting started guide in the docs. And if you have any questions, by all means, hop onto the NetBox channel in the NetDev Slack. That's netdev.chat if you haven't registered already. And I or one of the other maintainers can help you out with that. I will say also, if you want to pick up an issue, be sure to comment on it. GitHub won't let us assign issues to a user unless they've commented on the issue. So just a bit of tactical information there. The second avenue that I mentioned is non-code contributions. So maybe you're not a developer, you don't want to be a developer. That's fine. There's plenty of other ways you can contribute to the project if you're interested. Documentation, testing, not even writing tests, but just testing the application. Play around on the demo. If you see someone report a bug, can you replicate it? Because it's always great to get confirmation of people that say they can confirm they've been able to reproduce a bug. And then there's always people asking for help on GitHub discussions and on the Slack. Anything you can do to help out folks or point them in the right direction is also greatly appreciated. And we consider that contributions as well. And finally, if you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll see these community calls as they come up. We're going to try to keep doing them once a month, and I've started posting other NetBox videos there as well. So that's I've been doing all this under the NS1 Labs YouTube channel. Okay, with all that, we've got a few minutes left. We'll go through the community Q&A real quick. I think we've got like 3 questions. So the first is from Justin H. He asks, how much does feature parity enter into deciding feature request priorities? For example, if feature X works a certain way, are you trying to make sure that related feature Y works the same and has the same functions? This one's really difficult to answer without like a specific example or context. I've been trying to think about come up with an example, and I haven't been able to come up with anything really well. But I will say, so when we do something like journaling, for example, I'll use that as an example because I think we introduced that in 3.0. It's a relatively recent feature, but when we want to do that, it's something that, okay, we're going to implement journaling. We're going to do it for all the models for which it makes sense to do it, right? It's not something that we would do for one model at a time. So that is a concern, and it is a pretty major one, really, I think. Whenever we decide we're going to do something, like if we're going to implement a new bulk edit functionality or something, we want to make sure that it's going to be able to be implemented consistently across NetBox with a reasonable degree of consistency, at least. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, drop into the NetBox Slack, and happy to discuss it more. It's kind of hard to talk more about it without using specific examples. So I'm curious what drove that question, if you'd like to talk about it more. Next question we have from Matt, not this Matt, different Matt. The plugin community has slowed with developing new plugins or keeping up with NetBox breaking updates as of late. Is there any effort to decrease the barrier to entry for new and existing plugin maintainers? So again, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. There have not been any breaking changes to the plugins framework since it debuted in 2.8. Well, with the exception of some changes to the templates for the UI styling. Again, what a lot of people will do is they'll start developing a plugin and pulling out supported components, and then say, oh, well, let me just go grab this table class or this model class or something from NetBox that's not a supported or documented component. And I understand why people are doing that. They're trying to minimize boilerplate and things that are duplication of effort. Unfortunately, those components were not ready to use simply, so we've decided not to support them yet. That's changed significantly, as you can see now with 3.2, fortunately. But yeah, a lot of that, if you've used unsupported components from within NetBox in a plugin, you'll likely need to refactor a considerable amount for 3.2. But we think with the new changes, and again, giving all this 6-week period for people to provide feedback on what the new framework looks like, hopefully we're going to alleviate a lot of that moving forward. So I do expect that it should be a much smoother experience developing plugins moving forward. At least that's my hope. And again, any feedback you have for us in regard to that, greatly appreciated, especially if you get it to us before the 3.2 final release in early April.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. I think a lot of the what might be considered a breaking change in the recent releases is more UI related, kind of like Jeremy was saying. That's mainly from moving from Bootstrap 3 to Bootstrap 5, and some of that's kind of out of our control because that team has changed different things about how that framework works, and so there's not a lot we can do there. But I think for the most part, things moving forward should stay pretty much the same. We don't have any plans to. There's really nothing next to move to for quite a while, so it should be pretty stable as is.
Yeah, there's been some discussion about implementing sort of an abstraction layer around the UI stuff, so that instead of having to write like style compliant HTML, you would just kind of use tags or inclusion templates or something. And that's definitely something we'll explore. It's probably not something that'll make it into scope for 3.2 just because we've got so much else going on with it. I could be wrong. We have another month until the final release, so that might be worth exploring more as well. If not in 3.2, I expect to see something like that in a future release, perhaps 3.3 or 3.4, just depending on where priorities end up falling for the expansion of the framework. So, I mean, to be clear, we do track the framework extensions that we have in place for 3.2 are being tracked under issue 8333. That is probably going to stay open beyond 3.2. I think we're probably going to keep using that as sort of a master issue for anything framework, or anything plugin related beyond the 3.2 release as well. So that's again the master tracking issue. But if anyone has a specific idea for something like that, by all means open an issue if one hasn't been opened already. And if it looks doable, then we'll go ahead and tag that under 8333 for implementation. Last question here we had was from Peter V. I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit. Do you have a plan for modeling in NetBox? I'm going to butcher this. Sorry. I think the question here is how to model things like fabric extenders in NetBox. So these are switches. Typically, if you're not familiar, typically you have it's kind of an extension of the chassis-based switch paradigm, I guess, where you've got kind of two central switches, and then each of them have remote line cards essentially that exist as typically 1U boxes in different racks that are backhauled to the two parent switches. This is one of those things that becomes really, really difficult to model, unfortunately. We have the ability to model virtual chassis in NetBox, and that's probably a good 70 or 80% fit for this. Admittedly, it's kind of challenging, and it does require a degree of suspension of disbelief to model those. Typically, what we'll see people do, though, is just model the whole thing as a virtual chassis, where you have the member switches or fexes or remote line cards, whatever you prefer to call them, are just members of the virtual chassis. And you can still model the physical connectivity, the backhaul links between the fex and the parent switches, irrespective of the virtual chassis. So that's typically what we recommend people to go to do. There hasn't really been a lot of activity recently as far as modeling fabric extenders. I think what happens is most people happen upon a solution that works reasonably well for them and stick with it. Again, it just kind of falls down to convention. That said, we're open to ideas for any specific implementations. So if you have, if anyone has a proposal for a specific way to model it that doesn't break the existing data model, it's a pretty big hurdle to cross. But if you do have any ideas, we're open to that. So, okay, that was it. I forgot to put an ending slide on here, so this is where we'll end. Matt, Dan, thank you both for joining me today. Appreciate it. You have anything else to share before we sign off?
No.
Nope. I'm good.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended today. Again, we'll do another one of these next month, probably right before the 3.2 final release. So that should be pretty cool. It'd be interesting to see how much progress we make in the next 30 days or so. All right, that said, thank you, everyone.